Who is the prophet Isaiah, and what is his book all about? Welcome to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Cosart, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. This week we begin an exciting new series of Bible lessons focused on the Old Testament book of Isaiah. Isaiah is a fascinating book full of 66 chapters. In fact, Isaiah is the most quoted book in the New Testament outside the book of Psalms. In fact, he's often referred to as the gospel prophet. So to help guide us through this exciting, enriching lesson this quarterly, we have a special guest, Dr. Roy Gane, who just happens to be the author of this quarter's Sabbath School lessons. Dr. Gane is a professor of Old Testament studies at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary in Berrien Springs, Michigan. Dr. Gane, it's our privilege to have you here at Theology Sabbath School. And before we jump into the lesson, perhaps we could start off by having you share with our viewers a little bit about who you are.
Thank you, Carl, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and always very happy to discuss Isaiah, which is one of my very, very favorite books in the Bible. And about me a little bit. I'm originally from Australia. My family immigrated to this country when I was 7 years old, so my dad could study where I'm teaching now at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary. So I taught after I got my PhD at University of California, Berkeley. I taught for 2 years at Pacific Union College, down south of where you are in Walla Walla. And I taught there for 2 years and then went to the seminary at Andrews University. And I've been here for 26 years in Michigan as professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern languages. So my wife is a Mesopotamian archaeologist, also has a PhD from UC Berkeley, and hers is in Mesopotamian archaeology. We have a grown daughter who has she has a husband and two children who are 3 years old and 8 months, a little girl and a little boy. So we're just thrilled and enjoying being grandparents and loving life and grateful that we're staying well, and we hope you all are staying well as well.
Yeah, it's interesting how fast time goes by. You mentioned you've been there for 26 years, and I think I was there about 20 years ago, and I took beginning my what I thought my doctoral studies there, but I ended up going someplace else in the end. But I took a class from you on a rather not the most intriguing book, but the book of Leviticus. But I can say that on the basis of your class, I found the book to really be fascinating. So it was a good class. So I'm looking forward to a little easier book for us this quarter, the book of Isaiah.
It's difficult in other ways, though, and very challenging. Yes.
You know, our viewers are always interested to know a little bit of the backstory. We know these quarterlies that come out, sometimes they're written, 5 or more years in advance. And how they come about, sometimes interesting, whose idea it was. Is there any kind of a backstory you can tell us on how this came about? Was this your idea? How did it all happen?
I think part of the reason it happened is because I had already authored a quarterly on the book of Judges in 1996. And my father was the editor of the Sabbath School Quarterly at that time. And then I was asked to write the quarterly on Isaiah. I was given 5 years for that project. My father, I think, was still the editor at the time when I was asked to do that. And I think it was the idea of the ministerial secretary or someone there at the general conference. I don't think it was necessarily my father's idea to have me write it. So I got the contract, but I was really busy. I was starting my teaching career at PUC and everything, and I was very busy and didn't have time to complete it. And I came down to within a few weeks of the deadline at the end of 5 years. Now, this is 15 years ago. This quarterly is being recycled. Okay, so it's already came out in 15 years ago. And so it had to go through a review process, but they kept it basically the way it was. But back then, I came down within a few weeks of the deadline of finishing this quarterly, and I wrote to Clifford Goldstein, who by then was the editor of the quarterly, the Adult Bible Study Guide, and I said, Cliff, I need some more time. And he said, no. He didn't give me more time. He wouldn't give me an extension. So my dirty little secret, I wrote this quarterly in 2 weeks, flat. The last, and at the end it was 24 hours straight. I wrote 24 hours around the clock. So that's how this quarterly happened. So You know, there's advantages and disadvantages to that. One of the advantages is there's quite a bit of coherence because you're not laying something down, forgetting what you were and everything. It's all just one piece. And so, anyway, that's my story. Now you know.
You know, that is a fascinating story. So it was written not over 5 years, but over 2 weeks, really, as far as the writing goes. And
That's right.
just to make sure I understood you right, that this actually came out years ago, but now is being, I mean, recycled, I guess you might say, being used again.
Right. They do that every now and then with some quarterlies. Um, I couldn't have done that 2 weeks, mind you, without having a really good background in Isaiah. So I'd done my preparation before. I gained my love of Isaiah when I was a high school student, and our Bible teacher at College View Academy in Lincoln, Nebraska, actually had us do something really novel for kids. He had us read the Bible. Can you imagine that? I was amazed. And I was reading the prophets and just fell in love with the prophets. So that when I went to graduate school, I wanted to study the prophets. But my teacher, Jacob Milgram, hijacked me onto Leviticus, as you know. And that was quite a sacrifice, of course, for you to take that class. But when I was at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as an exchange student from Berkeley, I was a PhD student by then, I took 2 courses in Isaiah. One from the great Moshe Weinfeld in Isaiah 1 to 39, and the other one from the great Shalom Paul in Isaiah 40 to 66. So we covered the whole book of Isaiah with these 2 giant scholars, and those classes were all taught in modern Hebrew. Classes taught completely in Hebrew. So that was a real privilege. And then I went back to Berkeley, and there was another great scholar, Francis Anderson, who was there, and he taught us part of Isaiah 40 and following. And he had a particular interest in the artistic structure, and particularly the syntax that Isaiah was using. So we got a bit of background in that. He was the Francis Anderson who was the first one. He was really a pioneer to develop computer assistant tools for biblical research back in the days of the old mainframes. And he was, and another guy were pioneering, inventing this kind of approach to biblical studies. So I had a really good background in Isaiah and a lot of good notes and everything, and just had loved the book. Another angle of my interest in the book, though, is music. Because when I was an undergraduate, I was a theology major, but I also did a degree in music, a Bachelor of Music in piano performance. And I was very interested in composition, still am interested in composing music for congregational singing, like putting psalms to music and stuff like that. And so when I came to the book of Isaiah, and especially when I studied with Francis Anderson at Berkeley, and that was taught in English, but I got to analyzing the syntax and the structure, just the way the language is put together in Isaiah 40 and following. And it struck me as being like Beethoven, with these jagged contrasts and things going on. And to the extent that one commentator many years ago said he thought that Isaiah was drunk. He thought he was like ADHD. You know, he couldn't hold a subject. He had to keep jumping around. But the commentator didn't understand Isaiah's strategy. He knew exactly what he was doing. And it was like Beethoven with these jagged contrasts to get your attention. You know, like in the Missa Solemnis by Beethoven, I think it's in the key of D or something like that. And he comes along to a chord, and then massive silence. And then boom, in a immediate modulation. I guess anybody with a music background in there will know it's immediate is third, a modulation to another key that's unrelated, a third away, and it's just like hitting you over the head. It's just bam. And this is what Beethoven does. You know, we all know bum 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 bum. You know, all this drama, and then he gets to the end of the whole thing, and you know, bum 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 with the conclusion, and very dramatic, soft and lyrical, and then he slams you all of a sudden. But he's got your attention, and the whole thing is woven together into a magnificent fabric. And of course, Isaiah is speaking to people like us who know it all. See, we've heard it all in sermons, right? And he had to hit the people over the head with a 2x4. But it's a very, very elegant 2x4 because it's consummate oratory, amazing oratory. Okay, I've been rattling on. What's the next question you want to ask me?
So, talking about the beauty of the book of Isaiah, you know, I know that there are critical scholars who look at this as, you know, like Isaiah 1, Isaiah 2. So, am I kind of sensing there that the beauty of the book makes it seem like it's from one author? I mean, that's kind of what you're saying, the way it all plays out?
Well, one of the main reasons why scholars say that the book is two authors is because they know that the first part of the book is dated to the time of Isaiah of Jerusalem. And you have the dates of the king's reigns when he prophesies, starting with Uzziah in the 740s BC. So Isaiah himself was probably born in the maybe 720 or so. He's young, so he's having children still, right? So he's 20 or 30. In chapter 8, and earlier he's having children. So we know he's young then. And he saw this temple vision in the year that King Uzziah died, which is around 740 BC. And then he lived through into near the beginning of the 8th century, of the following century, okay, which was the 7th century, around the 680s, okay? So when we say it's a bit confusing. We say the 8th century, we mean the 700s. When we say the 7th century, we mean the 600s. So his life ran from about 720 or so. No, rather, let's see. Yeah, in the early part, we have to work backwards, okay? So the year that King Uzziah died is about 740. So about 20 years before that would take us about 760, 765, along in that range. Would be when Isaiah was born, maybe 770, along in there. Okay, then he starts his prophetic ministry about the 740s, and then he continues after that until about the time of Manasseh, when Manasseh is, by tradition, Jewish tradition, he cut Isaiah in two, cut him in two. And that reminds us of what it says in Hebrews 11. Some were sawn in sunder, and that's very likely Isaiah. But of course, the modern scholars saw his book in two. And it's not very funny, actually. I'm always struck by the irony of it. Manasseh saw him, but they saw it not only in two, but in three. Many scholars believe that Isaiah 1 to 39 is from Isaiah of Jerusalem, which is clearly dated. But then they say that chapters 40 to 66 must be later. And many of them say that 40 to about 55 is second Isaiah, and 56 to 66 is third Isaiah. And the reason they do that is because they don't believe in predictive prophecy. They don't believe that God could predict by name Cyrus, who shows up in chapter 44, 45 of Isaiah. And so this part of Isaiah, they say, has to be much later in the time of Cyrus, who was about 150 years after Isaiah. He's after, like at the end of the Babylonian captivity. And because they don't believe in predictive prophecy, they say it had to be written by someone who knew Cyrus by name and lived at that time. And then the last chapters of the book, some scholars think, reflects the time later in the return from the exile. And so that's why they do this. They are not accepting predicted prophecy, and they think that when something is predicted, the prophecy has to be living. The prophet has to be living at that time and could not be seeing it way in advance. So I don't accept those constraints because I believe in predictive prophecy. We can see that very clearly in the book of Daniel and elsewhere. And of course, if you don't believe in predictive prophecy, it wipes out one of Isaiah's major arguments, because he says this in chapters 40 and following. Can your God see the future? Can anyone else tell the end from the beginning? My God can do that. And so the scholars who try to wipe out that aspect of Isaiah are really eviscerating, they're just gutting one of his core arguments for God being really God. As far as the whole book hanging together, there are a number of different motifs that keep showing up, like the Holy One of Israel, for example, that unify the book. And the latter part of the book doesn't have Isaiah's name in it, which gives the impression that it's just continuing the book, although it's talking about another time period. And we could not imagine that there would be such a great writer. For many scholars, he's the greatest prophet of all, second Isaiah, but he doesn't have a name, except they call him the second Isaiah. This would be unprecedented for there not to be sort of a historical notification or background, something about this great anonymous prophet. Come on, no. Besides, I've been in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem when I was studying there with my wife, and we went to the Shrine of the Book, which is the part of the museum. It's shaped like the top of one of those jars that had the scrolls in it from Dead Sea Scrolls. And you go in there, and you can't see it now because they've had to take it away because it was deteriorating. But I saw the great Isaiah scroll, and they had it open right in front of me. I saw it. They had it open to the place where chapter 39 goes to chapter 40, right there. I could read the text in Hebrew. It's very, very legible if you know Hebrew of that script. And so, and there is no break. There's no break at all in this manuscript from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is around the time of Christ, or maybe even slightly before the great Isaiah scroll. There is just simply no evidence for there being a division in the book. Ongoing debate and everything, but modern scholars, if you get a scholar who really accepts the Bible for what it is and doesn't try to read these scholarly presuppositions into it, like John N. Oswalt, I recommend his commentary. He has a 2-volume commentary, New International Commentary on the Old Testament series, great piece of work, scholarly. And then a few years later, more accessible to more people with a lot of practical application and things like that, less dense from a scholarly point of view and more readable for ordinary people. This is the NIV Application Commentary series, commentary on Isaiah. And he doesn't believe in 2 Isaiahs or 3 Isaiahs. He believes in 1 Isaiah. Also, Alec Mottier in his commentary on Isaiah. So a number of these evangelicals are just taking the book for what it is, taking the evidence and not trying to impose presuppositions on the book.
Yes, interesting. I really appreciate. I could tell this is going to be a rich quarter. I guess on maybe a broader question would be, what would your hopes, goals be for readers who are going through Isaiah this quarter, going through what you wrote? What would be your hope or wish for them to have happen while they experience the book of Isaiah?
Several things. One is I would hope that they would get hooked on the book of Isaiah as I am, just totally in awe of this incredible masterpiece. I mean, it's like standing and looking at one of the great pieces of art by Michelangelo or something like that, or a great musical piece. Maybe that's a better analogy because it's really a fabric of composition that ebbs and flows and does different things and has form and structure and so on. But the language is so magnificent. I regard it as really the pinnacle of English literature in English translation. And believe me, the Hebrew is much better. In the Hebrew, you get the word plays, and you get the assonance and the various kinds of things like this. You get the rhythm. I mean, you listen to the first part of Isaiah 40, Nachamu ami yomer Elohechem, davhu alev Yerushalayim v'kiru elecha. You get short, long, like bum, and all of these things. And then you get the imagery and so on. You just see, even in English, a lot of this comes through, but in Hebrew, you get the more nuanced, behind the scenes kinds of things that just turn a scholar on. But any person can read the book of Isaiah and just get excited about the literary artistry and the message that is coming across as so powerful. It makes sense that the amazing message is conveyed in a vehicle that is a really high quality vehicle. I mean, it's a Bugatti, it's a Rolls Royce, it's a Master. It's just an amazing vehicle, luxury limousine to convey this amazing message. So, or it's like, a beautiful painting has to have a very elegant frame around it to get across the message that wants to be portrayed. And that's what it's doing. But the other thing is, in terms of the message itself of the book, there is so much, and we're going to get into this a little bit, but there is so much. Human nature doesn't change. And the basic dynamics of the divine-human relationship don't change. Because of that, God doesn't change, and human beings are similar. Yes, people back there, they had a lot of cultural things. They had their cultural garb that they brought with them, and so on. But basically, they had forgetfulness, they had greed, they had lust, they had all kinds of desire to oppress others and get the upper hand and so on, and didn't like to be rebuked. They liked to use rituals and things like this to make themselves feel good, like they're doing the right thing, and so that they're in with the in group, and then they can do whatever they want on the side and so on. and just oblivious of the coming storm. See, in terms of the historical background of the book of Isaiah, John Bright, I believe it is, I think it's John Bright, History of Israel. In his History of Israel, he points out that Israel had lived in a power vacuum for 500 years. 500 years. The Israelites, between the major powers to the north, there was previously there was a Hittite superpower. To the south was Egypt, and they were both very powerful. And in the days of Moses, you had very, very powerful pharaohs. And then and Mesopotamia was very powerful at various times. And in earlier periods, they would come from these different directions, and they would take over Palestine and control them and so on and so forth. But there was 500 years when all these big powers were weak. And so God's people got to flourish. And you had the kingdoms of David and Solomon, and then the divided empire and all of these subsequent kings and so on, right up until 745 BC. 745 BC, just before Uzziah died. In the early lifetime of Isaiah, it all ended, because the one who came to the Neo-Assyrian throne was Tiglath-Pileser III. And Tiglath-Pileser III went on the warpath for Assyria, went on the line of conquest, and was extremely aggressive, very successful. These people were like like ancient Hitlers, like Hitler is in modern times. Just went on the warpath, determined to dominate, just total domination. And they wanted to wash their weapons in the Mediterranean. That's literally what they said in their text. Get all the way to the Mediterranean, cut down cedars of Lebanon, wash their weapons in the Mediterranean. And they wanted to take over as much as they could and loot, plunder, and particularly take vassals that they could extort all kinds of tribute from them. And so at this point then, Tiglath-Pileser then comes. And this is the end of the time of peace for Israel. They had minor problems, Edom, Moab, and these countries around about, or the Philistines. That's nothing compared to the superpowers. And now Assyria came and threatened northern Israel and Judah, and that has a lot to do with the dynamics, particularly in Isaiah 7, because there you have because the Neo-Assyrians under Tiglath-Pileser, then Shalmaneser V, and then the other kings, and then Sargon II, they were threatening Syria. See, there's Assyria and there's Syria. They're two different ones. Syria had its capital in Damascus, and they were threatening Syria, which had warred against northern Israel for centuries. They've been fighting. You see the Elijah, Elisha stories, they're battling back and forth, right? But now there's a superpower that's going to wipe them both out. So they joined forces in order to stand their ground and hopefully stand up to Neo-Assyria. But they want the support of Judah to the south. Judah doesn't want to get involved. Ahaz doesn't want to get involved. And so, but they want his support, and they don't want someone on the other side that they have to deal with. They want to control Judah. And that's why in Isaiah chapter 7, they were threatening to take over Jerusalem, put a puppet king on the throne, dethrone Ahaz. And that's where the whole Emmanuel story comes in. Is he really going to have faith? And he didn't. He bribed Tiglath-Pileser, who came and he conquered northern Syria. He conquered Syria. He conquered northern Israel. And then Judah was under the sphere of influence of Assyria because they had asked for help. It's like a mouse asking a cat for help. That's what it's like. You're totally under the domination of that big pussycat. And it's a catastrophic situation. Excuse my puns. It's one of my worst faults. So they were in trouble, and it was caused by this faithless king Ahaz, who was succeeded by faithful king Hezekiah, who then, by God's grace, he stood up to the Assyrians who were surrounding the city of Jerusalem. So this is a tremendous amount of drama, a lot of stress in the book of Isaiah. And what you find is, and this is back to your question, what do I hope the people get out of this? We are living in times of stress, but not greater than that. Not yet. And we need to realize the main theme of the book of Isaiah. Hang on to God's word. Be faithful to him. Trust him no matter what. Know that his Messiah is coming, the Prince of Peace, Emmanuel, who is, and then there are several different names, Wonderful Counselor, Almighty God, the things we sing about in the Messiah, right? If we do these Isaiah these Messiah sing-alongs. A lot of the words come from Isaiah. So we need to internalize that message of faith when there is a time of crisis. And we need to hang on no matter what. To God, we need to be faithful to him, to his covenant, and we need to be faithful to each other and hold together and lift each other up in times of crisis and move on. So I hope that people can gain encouragement, warning, and all the rest of it from the book of Isaiah, as I have. It'll change people's lives, really.
It's really a great introduction, I think, to the book. And what I like about it is it's so rooted in historical context. And I mean, it just makes it come alive to us. Now, I'm curious, though, if we can actually look into this week's lesson, particularly chapters 1 through 5. Isaiah starts off with, powerful passages that, that your sins be as scarlet, they may be white as snow. Like everyone, knows that passage. So what's happening in these chapters? How do we see the plight of Judea, the human departure from God? How do we see that in these chapters?
All right. So right at the very beginning of the book, Isaiah gets your attention because after the first verse, when he says, when he prophesied, which is important to lay the historical groundwork, and that also puts you in touch with the books of Kings and Chronicles that have all those details that then you know the framework within which Isaiah is working and the stress that he's dealing with. And then he goes on and he just gets your attention with this imperative. 1 verse 2. Here's the message. Shim'u shamayim. Can you hear that in Hebrew? Shim'u shamayim. Shem. Shim'u is an imperative. Hear. And then shamayim, O heavens. Hear, O heavens. Give ear, O earth. And then he's really, this is a covenant lawsuit in a sense. He's arraigning the people of Judah, God's people, God's covenant of people. And he's for rebellion against him. And then he uses wonderful imagery. He's talking there in verse 3. The ox knows its owner, the donkey its master's crib, but Israel doesn't know, my people do not understand. Now you imagine how gripping that is. They all had oxen, they had donkeys. These animals knew who their owners were. They could go by themselves practically into their owners' sheds. They knew exactly what to do. And yet Isaiah is telling his people, you are more stupid than a donkey. Those animals are more intelligent than you are. They knew who they belong to, but you don't know who you belong to. And what's worse, it's willful. Now, when you think about it, in my this book here is the companion book that I wrote, the book of Isaiah, Thoughts as High as Heaven. Okay, so that's just come out from Pacific Press. And here I started off by talking about identity theft with regard to Isaiah 1. Identity theft. But they had stolen their own identity. It's bad enough when someone else takes your identity, but when you give up your own identity, that's pretty sad. It's pretty ironic. And so with this imagery now, Isaiah already has your attention. And then he goes on and tells them how corrupt they've been in the next verses. They've despised the Lord of Israel. And then he tells them that they're sick. Now, of course, talk about a Laodicea type message, huh? Do we think that we're in need of nothing and all the rest of us? But what does the message of Laodicea tell us? You're a Revelation expert. It tells us that we're a mess. We don't realize it. We just need to look in the biblical mirror. And Isaiah describes it very graphically. The whole head is sick. The whole heart is faint. From the sole of the foot, even to the head, there's no soundness but bruises and wounds and raw wounds that are not pressed out or bound up or softened with oil. And then he talks about your country lies desolate, your cities are burned with fire. Now, we don't know exactly when that happened. This looks like Isaiah 1 may have been written later and then put on the beginning of the book because it's referring to historical events that did not occur during the reign of the King Uzziah. During King Uzziah, everything was a very long reign, 52 years, very prosperous, long reign. And of course, at the end, we know what happened. He went into the temple and tried to be like a priest to burn incense. And when he got angry at the priest, the Lord struck him with so-called leprosy, the skin disease. It's not modern leprosy, but it's a skin disease. And so that's the significance of when you read Isaiah 6, because it says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. And instead of this sinful, impure mortal king who dies, he looks up, he sees the immortal king who is pure and holy and sinless, who really is in charge. And that's just an incredible vision. So this city's burned with fire must have happened sometime later. And then this chapter 1 apparently was put on the beginning of the book, but very effectively to introduce the theme of the whole book. And then it talks about foreigners devouring your land. And then in verse 8 of chapter 1, this very melancholy scene. The daughter of Zion, referring to Jerusalem, is left like a booth in a vineyard, like a lodge in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. I mean, that is so pathetic, right? Here's this mighty great Jerusalem with the temple and the palaces and everything, and it's left like a lodge in a cucumber field. And then the next verse is, here comes the transition. And this gives us an idea, an illustration of what I talked about, Isaiah's drama. Because in verse 9, in 1 verse 9, he says, if the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we should have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. Well, that gets you to thinking, doesn't it? A few survivors in Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, so maybe we are living in Sodom and Gomorrah. But it's not, you're not really thinking about how bad you are at that point. I'm not thinking about, well, I might be one of those people that really deserved it in Sodom and Gomorrah. But it's just contrasting or comparing the state of desolation. It would have been completely desolate. It's being overrun by foreign armies. It's messed up like a besieged city. But, that's just describing the result of what happened, which is not our fault. The next verse, Isaiah 1 verse 10, then Isaiah pivots. You can see him turning 90 degrees, and he turns and he shouts. He screams at his audience, so to speak, these rulers. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the teaching of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Now that is totally stunning. See, he's made them sorry for themselves, see, because they're overrun. Oh, it's so sad. We've got this terrible situation and so on as a result of your faithlessness. And then, but they're not thinking they're that bad, really. We've just been a little forgetful and all the rest. And then he just turns on them and lets them have it. Totally lets them have it. And that's Isaiah for you. That's the kind of stuff he does. So you'll have these decrescendos and crescendos and subito forte, suddenly loud, and these kinds of things to get their attention. And then, of all things, for him to attack at that point, you would think he would attack them for bribery, extortion, oppression, being mean to the widows and orphans. Well, that comes later in the following chapters, and to some extent in this chapter. But what does he hit them? Where does he hit them first? Their sacrifices. Of all things that they think that they're doing right is their sacrifices. And that's exactly where he hits them. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices? Basically, he's saying, your sacrifices are supposed to be a pleasing aroma coming up to me with a smell of faith and loyalty and all the rest. And here, they stink to me. I can't stand them. Get them out of here. Okay? And it's totally, totally jarring. Look, in terms of modern application, yeah, it's a bit scary to go there. What about all the things that we go through? And yet, if that's just a facade, if that's hypocrisy, and that's just to make us look good. Mm-hmm. And I've been in church, a big church, a long way from you, where you are, long way from where I am, where I knew some people in that church. One guy was a deacon, and I knew the kind of life he was living, and greed and extortion and immorality and all kinds of other stuff, but he was a deacon, and that made him look good. And it actually promoted his ability to function in that community. See, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. But the Lord sees straight through it. Now this gets back to Leviticus, of course. I resist mentioning Leviticus, because in Leviticus it promises that if you bring the right kind of sacrifice, then it's going to be a pleasing aroma to God. He's going to accept it. And in the process, he accepts you. And that sacrifice points forward to the perfect sacrifice of Christ, which we accept by faith. And they brought just these little token offerings to God to accept the much greater sacrifice of Christ. And but it says there in Leviticus that they would be accepted, but there is a condition that's implied, and that is that they have their hearts where their actions are. Their hearts and their hands have to be together. But here in Isaiah, they weren't. And in the book of Leviticus, it says in Leviticus chapter 4, verses 20, 26, 31, 35, it says, the priest will make atonement for him or make expiation for him, that is by performing the ritual, and it shall be forgiven him. He shall be forgiven. Who does the forgiving? Not the priest. God has never given the right to a human priest to forgive sins. God always forgave directly. Now here in Isaiah, God withholds that forgiveness because he's a being with volition, with will. He withholds it because of their hypocrisy. So they do all the right ritual things. The priests do everything perfectly, but God doesn't accept it. Why? Because the very same hands, and it's very explicit here, this very same hands that have the blood from the sacrifices on their hands have the blood of their fellow people on their hands from murder and stuff like that. And what God is saying, all this ritual is just for nothing. It's adding sin to sin. It's not taking care of the sin, it's adding more sin because it's hypocritical. When you spread out your hands, I'll hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. He wouldn't even listen to their prayers. Now, some scholars have thought that Isaiah and other prophets like Amos and so on are rejecting the biblical sacrificial system. They are not. And I wrote an article about that in a book on the history of the prophets, prophetic interpretation. They are not. What they're doing is objecting to hypocrisy. That's the problem. And it's very explicit. It's very clear. The fact that the prophets that God said through the prophets, I won't even listen to your prayers, shows that it's not just about animal sacrifices. It's about their relationship to him.
So it sounds like we could say that the situation, the human situation in those early chapters of Isaiah, is the result of a prosperity that's taken people's focus off God. They're content with themselves. They don't need him. That's led to formalism. So there's this distance now. They're just going through the motions. We're down to about 10 minutes left. Where's the good news in these chapters here? How do we see God coming after the rulers of Sodom, I guess, who are really his own rulers in Judea?
Yeah. Well, you made a good point that the people are complacent because they've just had a very long, prosperous rule with a lot of peace and that kind of thing. And so they just forget God, like it warns them in Deuteronomy, when you get to the land, don't forget about me when you're in prosperity and you eat and everything. But then the good news is coming in the next, we're just getting to that because it says in 1:16, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Now, how can you wash yourselves, make yourselves clean? The answer really is very clear here. But the way to do it is you come to God and he'll help you do it. You can't do it on your own. But what you've got to do is stop doing what you're doing. You've got to make a choice. You've got to cooperate with God, and you've got to stop all of those bad things that you're doing and learn to do good. See, it's not just instant. There's a learning curve. Learn to do good. Seek justice. So it's not just that you instantly do justice, but you have to turn and really try, intentionally, proactively moving towards justice, correct oppression, plead the widow's cause, and so on. But then in 1:18 is this wonderful, wonderful verse, come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Now that in itself, is amazing good news, because what did these people deserve? What do they deserve? They deserved death. Sudden, instantaneous, decisive death. That's what they deserve. And yet God says, come on, let's talk. I mean, that in itself is amazing. But then he says, okay, let's reason together. Now reason together, it's like, let's debate, let's hash this out, let's work this out. Says the Lord, though your sins are like scarlet. Why? Because they're like blood, because they've been shedding innocent blood. They shall be as white as snow. Though they're red like crimson, they'll become like wool, which is also white. So again, this is poetry here. Hear the poetry? Scarlet, white, snow, red, wool. This is just poetry with rhythm and balance. But what God is doing is offering them an amazing, amazing gift of forgiveness. We can start over again. We can forget all that bad stuff you've done. I'll give you another chance. But then he gives them a warning in the next verse. 1:19, if you're willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land, but if you refuse and rebel, you will be eaten by the sword. Now you see there's your choice. It's like when Moses said, I call heaven and earth to witness, I set before you a way of life and a way of death. That's your options, life and death. There's no in between. And here it is. Here it is. If you're willing and obedient, that is, if they cooperate with him, you'll eat the good of the land. But if not, you will be eaten. You're going to be the meal for the sword. And that, in fact, is exactly what happened, unfortunately, that they did reject. Then it goes on into portraying the city as a whore with murderers and so on, and the people loving a bribe and so on and so forth. And the following chapters, 2 through 4, expand on that, except at the beginning of chapter 2, there's this amazing vision of what could be. And this is paralleled in chapter 4 of the book of Micah, who lived at the same time, and the words are almost identical. Two prophets living at the same time, almost the same words, and scholars have trouble knowing who said it first. Did one quote the other one? We're not sure. Maybe they both got it directly from the Lord. And I just love this. This is a vision, a mission statement for really for us as Christians. It shall come to pass in the latter days, the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, shall be lifted up above the hills. It reminds you of the blessings and curses in the Pentateuch. You will be the head and not the tail. You'll be the head and not the tail. How many times do we as God's people kick and scream and fight to be the tail and not the head? Huh? Areas like social justice, for example. Huh? I don't think I have to go very much into Adventist history. We have fought in some ways to be the tail and not the head. And yet God says, if he's really lifted up there, and now of course the cross is lifted up, right, in John, and everyone flows to him. But here what people flow to is the temple, that God will teach us his ways. And it reminds you of Deuteronomy chapter 4, where Moses says to the people, you have these amazingly wise laws that come from God. And the people are going to say, this is a wise and understanding people. And they're going to inquire. And when they do inquire, Isaiah gives this idea, they're going to find out that they come from God. They're going to want to come from him, that we can walk in his paths, learn from him, including to give up disputes between nations. They'll beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And those words are engraved on the side of the United Nations building in New York. Amazing vision. And since those words are engraved, we've had millions of people dying through armed conflict. But then in verse 5 of chapter 2, after saying that these nations, the nations around about, are going to come to Jerusalem to learn about God from his temple, then he says, O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. In other words, all the Gentiles are going to do it. What about us? Are we going to catch the vision of the Gentile? He's shaming his own people in a sense, as Jesus in a sense was, by drawing attention to the faith of Gentiles, like the Syrophoenician woman and others, Jairus and so on. He was drawing attention to the faith of these Gentiles to shame his people. Why don't you have that same kind of faith? And instead of getting the message, they wanted to crucify him. Yeah. Well, we can go on a few words about chapter 5, or do you have some more questions? I'm just sort of rattling on here.
Our time is quickly coming to a close. I'm just curious if we could maybe summarize chapter 5 and leave us with kind of a take-home. Like if we were to summarize what we should take away from this week, maybe we could do that. So.
Chapter 5 starts off with this very short song. It's in poetry, and it says, let me sing for my beloved my love song. So you get the impression right away, this is about, we're going to discover it's about God and his people. So it's about God's love for his people and the very best that he wants for them. And the story goes that he had a vineyard on a fertile hill, and he poured all of his energy, his effort into it to make it the very best. Choicest vines, put up a wall around it. He put up a watchtower to watch, to keep others away, enemies, intruders, and so on. Hewed out a wine vat. Everything is just perfectly set up. You look for it to yield good grapes, but guess what? It gave bu'ushim, which means stinking things, rotten grapes. So here is something gone wrong, something gone wrong. And then he turns the tables. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do from my vineyard that I have not done in it? I looked for it to yield grapes. Why did it yield wild grapes? Now I'll tell you what I'll do to my vineyard. I'll remove its hedge. It'll be devoured. I'll break down its wall. It'll be trampled down. I'll make it a waste, and so on. And then he lowers the boom. He lowers the boom. Woe to those, yeah. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. He looked for justice, and here's some Hebrew that comes in here. He looked for justice, and that word is mishpat. But instead of justice, the mishpat vehine mispach, a cry. Mishpat mispach. See here the play on words? But instead he gets a cry. And he looks for righteousness, it's tzedakah, but he gets tzedakah. So these are word plays. They sound very similar. But God has done everything for his people. And in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, it points out the blessings and curses. And the blessings that God wants to lavish on his people if they will only follow him and his instructions and cooperate with him. Let him do for them what he wants to do for them. He'll just pour out his love. He'll make them the highest of all the nations so that they'll be elite, so that others come, not for the sake of elitism, but so, as Jesus said, don't hide your light under a bushel. Let it be seen so that people can see and give glory where? To your Father who is in heaven. Unlike what Hezekiah did, you remember when the Babylonian envoys came and he just gave glory to himself by showing them all the treasure, which they later came and got. That's not the idea. So the point here is that God has given us everything. He wants to give us excellence for evangelism. Excellence for evangelism. That's why it's important that Adventists have a higher, longer life expectancy. You know, these blue zones like Loma Linda, and I believe it wouldn't just be 10 years more than the average population. If we were doing things right, it would be 25 years more than the average population. God has blessed us with the health message so many ways, and that is all not just for ourselves, it's for evangelism. But one more final point, and then I'm going to end there, and that is, this is very sober, is verse 4. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? What more was there to do? And when God gets to the end of his options, he does everything. He pours everything out. And through the prophets, all the different things that he had the prophets go through, even the death of Ezekiel's wife was a mere illustration of their loss of the temple, which was their beloved. I mean, God was that serious about getting their attention. All of these different ways, he wants to, what more was there to do than I've already done in it? And when that point comes and God gives up on that, then the next thing is destruction. That's what happened to Judah in 586 when the Babylonians destroyed the city. That's what happened to Jerusalem in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the city. God had given up. And we don't want him to give up on us. We want to come to Revelation 22:11. He that is filthy, let him be filthy still. He that is righteous, let him be righteous still. And may that be us. And when it says, what more was there to do? Look at the cross. And that'll tell you what more was there to do that God has done. Pouring out his only son. And I'll never forget sitting in a class at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem taught by my teacher who became my good friend, Shalom Paul. Class taught in Hebrew. I was the only Christian to my knowledge. The room was full of Israelis, Jews, a rabbi as a teacher. And we happened to have come to Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53. You could have cut the air like a knife. I've never been in a classroom that tense because they knew the stakes involved. And the students thought that, well, this person, the suffering servant, must be the whole nation, because that's the standard Jewish explanation. The teacher showed, no, it's really a person. He's suffering, he's put in a tomb and all the rest of it. It's got to be an individual. Didn't know if it's Jeremiah or some other righteous person. Has to be an individual. But I'm sitting there going, yeah, I know who this is. And what more could he have done than he has already done in it? And so for me, it's total commitment. There's no holding back. If he's given everything, I've got to give everything. Isaiah gave everything. He gave his life at the end. And I want to do that too. Not necessarily to be cut in two, but I want to dedicate my life to the gospel, to the Holy One of Israel. I'm pointing to him as, and Ella White really emphasizes that was Isaiah's message. Look to the Holy One of Israel. Have faith in him, trust in him, believe in him, and cooperate with him.
Dr. Gane, this has been a delight. So thank you for taking the time to join us at Theology Sabbath School. And also a special word to our viewers too, to enjoy the opportunity we have this quarter to engage in the book of Isaiah. And may we be awakened from our complacency and recognize all that God has done for us. So again, everyone, take care. We'll see you next week as we continue in our study of the book of Isaiah. Until then, take care and God bless. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.